The morning mist clung to the valleys of the northern kingdom like a whispered secret. In the grand stone palace that crowned the highest hill, Alpha King Aldrich stood at the window of his son's chamber, watching the sun struggle to break through the gray clouds. His hands, calloused from years of battle and leadership, gripped the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. Behind him, in a bed far too large for such a small body, lay his only child. Prince Cassian, barely 5 years old, had been sick for 3 long months. The boy's breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that echoed through the silent room like a cruel reminder of the king's helplessness. Aldrich was a man who had conquered armies. He had united warring packs under one banner. He had faced down rogues and traitors without flinching. But this he could not fight. This invisible enemy that had stolen the light from his son's eyes and the strength from his small limbs was beyond the reach of his sword or his authority. The healers had come from every corner of the realm. They arrived with their leather bags full of herbs and tinctures, their ancient books bound in worn leather, their confident proclamations that they alone possessed the cure. One by one they had tried. One by one they had failed. The first healer had been an elderly alpha from the eastern highlands, renowned for his knowledge of rare medicinal plants. He had burned sage and scattered dried petals across the prince's bedsheets, chanting in a language so old that even the scholars could barely translate it. The prince had only grown weaker. The second healer had been a fierce beta woman from the southern isles who claimed to have studied with the mystics of the mountain peaks. She had prepared poultices that smelled of sulfur and earth, pressing them against the boy's chest and forehead. The fever had not broken, they kept coming. 10 healers, 20, 50, 100. The number climbed until Aldrich lost count, until the faces began to blur together in his memory, until hope itself became a distant, fading star. Some whispered that it was a curse. Others spoke of dark magic, of enemies seeking revenge against the Alpha King through his innocent child. A few dared to suggest that perhaps the moon goddess herself had turned her face away from the royal family. Aldrich refused to believe any of it. He only knew that his son was dying, and he was powerless to stop it. On the 100th day of the prince's illness, a day when the autumn rain fell like tears from the sky, the king sat beside his son's bed. The boy's hand, once so quick to grab at butterflies and reach for his father's face, lay still and cold in Aldrich's palm. The rise and fall of the small chest was barely visible beneath the heavy furs. "I would give my kingdom," Aldrich whispered to the sleeping child. "I would give my life. I would give everything I have if only you would open your eyes and smile at me once more." But the prince did not stir. That evening, as the palace fell into its sorrowful routine, a knock came at the servants' entrance. It was not the grand main doors where the important healers had entered with their entourages and their pride. It was the small wooden door at the back, where the merchants delivered bread and the farmers brought vegetables from the fields. The guard who answered found a young woman standing in the rain. She wore no cloak, only a thin dress that clung to her small frame, soaked through by the storm. Her hair, the color of chestnuts, hung in wet strands around a face that was pale and pinched with cold. But her eyes, those unusual amber eyes, held something the guard couldn't quite name. A certainty, perhaps, or maybe just a stubborn kind of hope. "I've come to heal the prince," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. The guard almost laughed. Almost. But something in her steady gaze stopped him. "The king has seen 1,000 healers," he said instead, not unkindly. "What makes you think you can help where they have failed?" "I don't think," she replied simply. "I know. Her name was Elena, and she was Omega. In the hierarchy of their world, she was the lowest rank, born to a family of farmers in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. She had no training from prestigious academies. She carried no ancient texts or rare ingredients. In fact, she carried nothing at all except the worn shoes on her feet, and a quiet conviction that had driven her to walk 3 days through rain and mud to reach the palace. The guard, moved by something he couldn't explain, brought her not to the main hall but to the head housekeeper, who brought her to the king's advisor, who finally, reluctantly, brought her before the Alpha King himself. Aldrich looked at the small dripping figure before him with hollow eyes. She was so young, perhaps no more than 20, so thin that a strong wind might blow her away, so obviously Omega that her scent filled the room with the gentle aroma of rain-washed earth and wildflowers. You come to heal my son, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and barely contained grief. It was not a question. Yes, your majesty, Elena replied, meeting his gaze without flinching despite the power that radiated from the Alpha King like heat from a fire. 1,000 healers have tried, Aldrich continued, each word heavy as a stone, alphas and betas with decades of study, masters of their craft. They have all failed. What could you possibly do that they could not? Elena was quiet for a moment, her fingers twisting together in front of her soaked dress. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. They tried to cure a sickness, your majesty. But your son isn't sick, not in the way they think. Something in Aldrich's chest tightened. What do you mean? May I see him? She asked instead of answering. Every instinct in the Alpha King screamed at him to refuse, to protect his vulnerable child from yet another disappointment, yet another failure. But he had nothing left to lose except the thin thread of time that still held his son to this world. So he nodded and led her up the winding stone stairs to the prince's chamber. The room was dim, lit only by a few candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of medicines and illness. Elena approached the bed slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She looked down at the small prince for a long moment, her amber eyes soft with something that looked like recognition. Then, without asking permission, without the dramatic gestures or elaborate preparations of the other healers, she did something remarkably simple. She climbed onto the bed beside the prince, careful not to jostle him, and gathered the small boy into her arms. She held him against her chest, one hand cradling his head, the other wrapped around his tiny body. And then she simply held him like a mother holds a frightened child, held him like he was precious and loved and safe. Aldrich moved forward, alarm and confusion warring in his chest, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way his son's labored breathing seemed to slow, to deepen. Perhaps it was the way the tension in the small body began to ease. Elena began to hum, a melody that had no words but seemed to carry the sound of wind through grass, of streams running over stones, of the quiet peace of a forest at dawn. She rocked gently, still humming, her eyes closed. And then she spoke, her voice a murmur against the prince's hair. You're not sick, little one. You're lonely. You're scared. You've been surrounded by strangers trying to fix you, but no one has simply held you and told you that you're loved. Aldrich felt the words pierce his heart like an arrow. In his fear, in his desperate search for a cure, when had he last simply held his son? When had he last sat with the boy without a healer present? Without that consuming terror that made him afraid to even touch his child lest he somehow make things worse. Your mama is gone, Elena continued, her voice a gentle lullaby. And your papa is so scared of losing you that he's forgotten how to show you he loves you. All these strangers with their potions and their spells, they mean well, but they can't give you what you need. And what you need, sweet prince, is to know that you're safe, that you're loved, that you're not alone. She held him tighter, her Omega scent wrapping around the prince like a warm blanket, carrying with it the instinctive comfort that Omegas could provide, the gentle nurturing that Alphas and Betas, for all their strength and knowledge, sometimes forgot was the most powerful medicine of all. I'm here, Elena whispered. You're safe. You're loved. Let go of the fear, little one. Let go and come back to us. Time seemed to stretch and slow in that candlelit room. Aldrich stood frozen, watching as minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. He watched as his son's breathing, which had been so shallow and strained for 100 days, gradually deepened into the natural rhythm of healthy sleep. He watched as color began to return to the pale cheeks. He watched as the small fingers, which had been so limp and cold, curled gently into the fabric of Elena's dress, and then, as the first rays of moonlight broke through the clouds and streamed through the window, Prince Cassian's eyes fluttered open. They were clear and bright, unclouded by fever or pain. The boy looked up at the young woman holding him, and then beyond her to where his father stood. Papa, the prince whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse but unmistakably his own. Aldrich was across the room in an instant, falling to his knees beside the bed, tears streaming down his face without shame or hesitation. Cassian, he breathed, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch his son's face. My boy, my precious boy. Elena gently shifted the prince into his father's arms, sliding back to give them space. She watched as the Alpha King held his son, really held him for the first time in months, both of them crying and laughing and whole. No one had cured the prince's body because there had been nothing physically wrong with it. The illness had been one of the heart, of the spirit of a small child who had lost his mother and felt his father slipping away in grief and fear. It had been a sickness born of isolation and loneliness, one that no herb or potion could touch. But the simple act of being held, of being comforted, of being reminded that he was loved and safe, that had been the cure all along. In the days that followed, Elena was offered riches and titles, a place of honor in the palace, anything her heart desired. But she refused it all. She asked only for a warm meal, dry clothes for her journey home, and the knowledge that the prince would be well. Before she left, Aldrich asked her how she had known what his son needed when 1,000 learned healers had not. Elena smiled, that quiet, gentle smile that seemed to hold all the warmth of summer. "Because I'm Omega," she said simply. "We remember what others sometimes forget. That power and knowledge and strength are important, yes, but so is gentleness, so is comfort, so is love." She looked at the king with those knowing amber eyes. "Your healers looked for a cure because that's what they were trained to do. But I looked at your son and saw what I would have wanted when I was small and scared and missing my mother. I saw a child who needed to be held." As Elena walked back down the road toward her village, the morning sun warming her shoulders, the Alpha King stood at his son's window, with the prince in his arms. Cassian was eating breakfast, chattering happily about the birds outside, his illness already fading into memory like a bad dream upon waking. Aldrich held his son close and made a silent vow. He would never again forget the simple truth that the Omega girl had taught him, that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from grand gestures or powerful magic, but from the simple act of holding someone close and reminding them that they are loved. And in a small village 3 days' walk away, Elena returned to her family's modest farm, her quiet life, and the simple joy of knowing she had saved a child's life not with power or position, but with the one gift that truly mattered, the gift of compassion.